I am going to start recording partly because Jen will want to watch this later, so this is her opportunity to do that, just so you know that that's happening. Everybody, it looks like, can hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can. Excellent, okay. And I think it's great that you got the videos on, so that's wonderful. And we've got somebody that's joining us. Sarah, who's your little friend there?
This is Theodore.
Hey, Theodore.
Say hi.
Hey, buddy.
Hi, Theodore.
Looks very serious. This is kind of a strange situation, isn't it? There we go. Okay, cool. So what we're going to be doing today. Sorry, say again?
I said, Sarah, do babies get free tuition for classes?
We won't charge.
I wish. No. He's auditing.
Yeah, he's just auditing the class.
There you go. Very good. Okay, so today what we're talking about is the self, and we're going to be doing a number of different activities. This is designed to work just like we would do a typical in-class lecture with all the usual whistles and bells of discussion and that sort of thing. We are going to be using, as I said, some of the additional technological features to make this work for us. So things like breakout rooms will be used in place of the Think, Pair, Share, or as a tool to do the Think, Pair, Share, online poll, that sort of thing. So treat this exactly like you would any other in-class lecture. And the other thing is, since this is the absolute very first time I'm ever doing this, I would love some feedback on whether or not we should continue doing this, if this is working for you. I know that there's a certain level of convenience, which we all appreciate, but I mean, we want this to work. So if this is not an effective way to deliver the content, please let me know. The other thing, and here's where I'd like some discussion and feedback from you all. The other part of this structure of the class that's new for me is the use of discussion boards as a way to talk about the readings. Again, I originally had this idea of doing it that way when I thought all of this would be delivered by Zoom, and then Francie told me I couldn't. So the comments that I saw, the discussion I saw online, I thought was really rich, and in fact, we were even laughing a little bit before about who was it, Jack? I guess Ryan just knew that he was going to comment on the article about ontological self, right?
Yeah, Ryan's got my number.
He's got it. Absolutely. How did this work for you all on the receiving end of this? What was it like?
I thought it was fine until, like, once you made it so you can reply back to the specific comments. Or do you know what I mean by that? I said that wrong, but at first we couldn't reply back to the comments, and now we can, so I'm good.
So that worked for you, getting that switch? Okay, good. Apparently I had made all of the other discussion boards that way. I went in and checked. It was just that one that I had missed. So they all should work that way. And if they don't, let me know and I'll fix it. So that's good. Other comments?
So is it due like Thursday? Like our response is due that Thursday that we have class?
Yeah, will it stay open going forward?
The way that I set it up is that it's open through, I think, midnight tonight.
Okay. I mean, just in purposes of like discussing some of these things, I almost would wish that like maybe our initial post is due Thursday, but like we can respond and still kind of have conversations up until the next one's posted.
Okay.
I don't know. I just feel like because if people post today, then I'm not going to I don't know.
Yeah, or having like a requirement of our first post has to be by Tuesday or something.
I'm open to either of those suggestions.
I say no to the second one.
You just want more time, Molly? Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I have no problem with that. I can easily leave it open longer. I originally turned them off every week just so that you didn't. The idea was to keep you moving on with the content, so you didn't get bogged down and think, "Oh my God, I have to go back and do all of them." But I can leave them open for another week or perpetually. I don't know. What do y'all like?
I'm curious, I don't think there's a feature that sends notifications, is there?
There is.
Okay.
Where is the
notifications on my phone every time somebody posts a new discussion. So if you just put Canvas on your phone, it automatically does.
Oh, right on. Okay, cool.
You can put Canvas on your phone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really helpful because then you know if somebody's like commented on your post and you can be like, oh, I'm going to actually have this conversation.
Yeah, it's a nice little prompt to remind you to respond.
Okay.
That's only if you have the notifications for Canvas turned on, just to make sure that feature's on, because I don't have my notifications turned on.
And also, it won't notify you unless you've already started a discussion post. You have to post first, and then it'll let you know if people are commenting on it. So.
Okay. Is that something that I have to turn on for everybody, or is that something you turn on individually?
You turn on individually.
Oh, okay. So, that's kind of a cool feature. I'm going to look into that. So what do you all think about keeping it open then for an extra week or for the remainder of the class? Do you have a preference?
I think if people want to talk, okay, great, we can talk. But as far as for me, I'm not going to go back after we've started a new discussion, just because we have a lot of assignments that I'll get confused if I have to go back and comment on things. So I prefer everything just to be due midnight the day of class. But that's just my preference. What do other people think?
I'm with you, Jenna.
I agree with Jenna.
Okay, cool.
Realistically, I mean, I think once class is over, it's unlikely that we're going to like continue the discussion, especially because we're going to have another discussion starting on Sunday or Monday, you know.
That's the idea, yeah. Why don't I open it up for another week, just for anyone who's interested, and that's absolutely fine. And I'll keep monitoring those as well if there's any additional comments. But I mean, I don't want anybody to feel like all of a sudden, you know, 8 weeks into the course, all of a sudden you've got to do all of these discussion posts. So, you know, think about it's 2.2 points. It's not a ton, but they add up, and they're designed to be quick and easy points. So let's just, if you would commit to getting at least the first comment in for sure. The person who's leading the discussion, though, obviously, your job is to continue to curate it, but not beyond that first week. So I can certainly do that. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the subject, because I know Jack and I will start a new thread on Sunday.
Right.
Right. Sunday night or Monday morning or something like that. I remember you talking about this before, but I honestly didn't write it down and I've forgotten. When there's like two MCs, like how do we do that?
You'll both be graded individually, so you should both expect to post your own kind of core thread. However, anybody else decides to follow off on that, that's completely their business. But both of you will still be responsible for independently curating the ongoing discussion. Now, that's not to say that you guys can't get in touch with each other and kind of coordinate your responses. Okay. I really don't care about that, but you'll be graded individually. So the idea is that I should see within the context of the discussion that you're both actively managing it, if that makes sense.
And is it okay if we, you know, kind of have like more theme-based prompts than like kind of responses to specific articles? So in other words, can we like sort of have thematic discussions where articles are synthesized, or do you want us to, you know, kind of, you know, here's the article, respond or react to it?
Thematic discussions are absolutely kosher, 100%. Yeah. it's really up to you to decide how you want to do that, giving you a lot of latitude and leeway here. The idea is just that it should be interesting. I mean, to the extent that these things can be, but and show that to me that you're synthesizing the information.
The information is pretty interesting, I think.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Cool. So we'll do that. Any other questions or comments then before we get rolling?
Mine was in regard to the length of the reply. Is it okay if we just do like 3 or 4 short replies, synthesizing like other people's thoughts instead of just like long paragraphs of this is what I thought about this? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was more conversation than just like a paragraph. I did both because I didn't know what was required. I saw all your replies said like a paragraph, or your rubric was like a paragraph, but I just didn't want to check before.
Yeah. That's absolutely fine. Either way, you don't feel obligated to write an essay here. This is not meant to be onerous. It's meant to be engaging. So whatever, either way works for me. Okay, cool. All right. Then, why don't we get rolling with our content? If I can make this go. Sorry, I just have to get my screen shared. Just a minute, folks. Here we go. Share screen. Where's share screen? There it is. Okay, do you all see the slides there? Yep, okay. So we're talking about the self today, which, to be entirely honest, this has a long history in psychology and social psychology in particular. This is one of those big foundational topics, and it makes it really important. And I say it's foundational because you're going to see it crop up all over the place. I also think it has a ton of applicability to clinical work and school psychology, quite honestly, psychology across the board. This is a really important topic. And it's been studied for a long time. I mean, it's not just psychology. I mean, it goes back millennia. So for example, if you've ever heard the saying cogito ergo sum, it was Descartes' way of saying, I think, therefore I am. And people just innately seem to think about this whole idea of who am I, what is this all about, and how does it relate to other people? So that's really what we're talking about today. Before we get rolling, I'm going to try out the polling feature. So I'm going to launch a poll here. You should see it on your screen. I want you to answer it. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. It's not a trick question, so just go ahead and answer truthfully. And when everybody's answered, one more person. We're almost to 13.
Wait, where do I go? I don't see it.
You don't see it? Check behind your window, the Zoom image. It might be behind it.
Yeah, it popped up as a different window.
Oh, okay. Mine was, let me see. No. I'll keep looking for it. You guys don't have to wait for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to share the results. So can you see the results of the poll now?
Yeah.
It was a simple question, right? Do you have a self? This is a fascinating response to me. And I'll tell you why. So 83% of you said, yes, you do. Two brave souls said that they have not, which I don't know what to make of that. We can have a discussion about that later. But when I originally started asking this question before this lecture, every year I would have people, I'd say, raise your hand if you have a self. And this was a big class of like 40 students, graduate students, and this weird thing happened where nobody raised their hand at first. I was like, oh my God, everybody's having an existential crisis. But what they're really doing is they're looking around. What the hell? What are other people saying about whether or not they have a self? They're referencing everybody else in order to make a determination about how they respond. So what I had people start doing then is close their eyes before they raise their hand. And this is kind of a similar situation. And it actually, the response here is pretty consistent with what I have found in other situations. You know, about 80% of people say that they do, and others don't. So, look, this is a deep philosophical question. Do you have a self or not? We're not really going to get into that much right now. But this part of the reason that this topic is so foundational and so important is that beyond the long history that it has, the way that social psychologists think about it. Remember, what is social psychology all about? It's the power of the situation. In our way of thinking about this, the self is just it's both a product of the situation and it influences the situation. So it's very, very powerful. I'm going to, oops, I hit the wrong button. Can you see that again? Yep, okay. So what we're going to do now is we need to have, this is where we're going to try the breakout rooms, okay? So this is going to be just like a regular think, pair, share. And I'm going to break us up into, I don't know, about 4 or 5 different groups. What's going to happen is that I'm going to tell the computer to randomly assign people to, I'll just do 4 rooms. So there's going to be 3 or 4 people in the group. I want you to discuss these questions. So what is the self, and more importantly, why is it important? So, and I'm going to give you a fairly beefy amount of time, maybe 8 or 10 minutes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in and out of each one of your guys' room to see how things are going. But then when we come back, what we're going to do is debrief with each of the groups. You're each going to have an opportunity to tell us what you were discussing and why you think the self is important, okay? And the computer will give you about a 1-minute warning when we're going to come back together, all right? So I'm going to set the rooms up here, and here we go. And just go ahead and click on the Join Breakout Room.
Jack, why did you say no?
I took issue with the article A, self, because I think we go through multiple iterations or understandings of a self, and that's kind of it's a transitory thing, and it's often created in reference to what's happening around us.
The external factors around us.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, apart from kind of like any like spiritual understanding of like self or no self in terms of like a meditative stance on being, I just think that our sense of identity, our sense of self is something that's constantly in transition. So to say we have a self to me kind of implies a state of permanence. But I think it generally all times in a person's life, there is a relationship or an understanding of self as being from those around us. So in that sense, there is a self, but there is not a self.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like we think there is, because it feels like we've got like somebody in our head, like driving around this like meat machine, and all of our experiences are pretty coherent, and we're the same person over time, or the same self. But yeah, I'm not. I don't think that's the case.
Do you think there's core like fundamental characteristics that we have as a person that can be called ourself?
Well, I don't know. Like, how much do we have to like, how much do you have to be like, I don't know, like you take drugs, you have a bad accident, right? Any of these sorts of things. And they really start to interrupt, that sense of self. If you want to talk about one single self, right? Like a self. I think that where do you draw those lines?
Why does it have to be static though?
Well, I mean, I think that's the way that we always talk about it.
Self is. So I think like no matter what, there is some like identifiable thing that is you. But I think like it's also like the journey of self-actualization is something we all kind of go through in our entire lives. And like I was talking to one of my friends about this a couple of weeks ago about how like you don't know who you really are as a person until the day you die, because like that's when you stopped kind of growing what yourself is, you know?
Yeah, that's valid. I get it. Makes sense. Well, you and your friends get deep.
Oh yeah.
I was like, what about like Sesame Street?
You're like 4 beers, and then all of a sudden, it's really deep.
Yeah. Well, two of my friends that live out here, I went to college with, and I used to take like, you know, political science and philosophy classes with. So we sometimes get into it.
God, I would never take another philosophy class after that one.
I really enjoyed philosophy and logic. Logic was where I was like, fuck yeah, logic.
Yeah. I'm a big game theory guy. I mostly because I love games. So
yeah. Well, my thing was, I thought the self also, you guys didn't really seem as like hot on this, but I think your self is also a reflection of what other people think you are too.
Oh, absolutely. Like I think there's one of the articles talked about like the intrinsic versus extrinsic like self-worth stuff, and I think that the key is a balance of.
So you didn't miss much, but
okay.
Yeah, and the commercials weren't really that good either. So yeah, whatever you did was probably fine.
We were just discussing that.
Mm-hmm.
And we left off at that our own sense of self, how that plays into somebody else's sense of self, and what somebody might think is acceptable to one person might be unacceptable to another person. And we kind of got off on that tangent.
Yeah. And we were kind of talking about how like yourself in different settings might be a little different, but then there should be some continuity across settings for who you are. But then where is that line in different settings? And then yeah, it's all just a compilation of who we are and how we act and how we think. And
I like that you brought up that it's situationally dependent. I mean, that's spoken like a good social psychologist. And I think that's absolutely right. There's a lot of conflict, though, especially in popular media, about this idea of a true self. This idea that it's static and a very defined thing. And once you find out what that true self is, then you're somehow, I don't know, magically self-actualized or something. What do you think about the importance, though, of the self? Why does it matter?
We talked about like knowing who you are and just kind of your preferences and how you look at life. And I mean, Sarah, you added more stuff to this, but just kind of knowing your views, your morals, your ethics, just kind of how your personality is going to relate to the world around you.
And your culture too influences that, and that sense of self kind of helps you solidify your place or role in the world.
Okay, good. Think about it also in terms of clinical objectives, or ed psych for that matter. How does that relate to some of the work that you all are being trained to do? And I'm going to jump out so you can talk about it amongst yourselves and check in with some other groups, and we'll come back together in a bit, okay?
Okay,
thanks.
Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good.
You got it all figured out?
Well, I think we were all sort of in agreement.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is it?
Well, we just talked about like if not having a sense of like if having a sense of self isn't important and it's sort of extraneous, then why is it diagnosable? Like why is it a concerning thing then when people don't have a sense of self, or they've just imprinted and taken their parents' personalities? Like why does it matter then? If it's not an important thing, then why is that a conversation even worth having?
And okay, so are you saying then that psychological problems are in relationship to people or caused by people just assuming that their self-concept is what other people say it is?
No. We were more saying that it's sort of impossible to not have a sense of self.
Okay.
And if you don't, in today's society, it is a problem. It is problematic. And so like if we didn't have a sense of self, then why would that be something that we even considered?
So is the sense of self the self in and of itself? It's a lot of selves. Does having, if what you're saying is having self-awareness, that is the key. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Guys, back me up here.
Yeah, I think it's more than self-awareness,
self-awareness, though.
Self-awareness? Okay. And then if you're not self-aware, society...
But it's also about having a value system for yourself and like knowing what is important to you and what's not important to you. So I think it's somewhat about identity, but it's also about what do you personally care about and why you care about that.
Okay. And what's interesting is you're bringing up this notion about the cultural relevance of one's self-awareness. It becomes problematic if you don't have this robust sense of self-awareness. And I think that's just a fascinating concept, and it really begs the question of then where does the self come from and what defines robust self-awareness or good self-awareness so that you don't have those psychological problems. We are about to get back together, so I wish we could talk about this more, but maybe we can talk about it as a larger group. Okay?
Can I ask you a question before you leave our group?
Yep.
I sent you an email, but it was like right before class, but I was just wondering if I could leave class around like 5:15ish to go help Francie out with the new interviewees are having like a social event tonight.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, we'll see you back in just a minute. Okay, close all rooms. All right. So people should start filtering back in just a minute. There's Tanner.
Whoops. I did not mean to jump out of our group so quickly.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We're people are meant to start coming back together, so that's absolutely fine. Here people come, they're just finishing up their conversation. Oops. Here we go.
We're back.
And we're back. Okay. We got everybody in. Okay, so as I was popping in, I was hearing some really interesting discussions already. So I would like to talk about that a little bit in this larger group format. I was going to try to share my my whiteboard here and write, but I realized then I can't see anybody. So if you're raising your hand, I wouldn't be able to see you. So I'm just going to leave it like this, and I'll take notes as we talk about it. But I do want to hear from each group. So I'll just open it up more generally. Is anybody interested in starting us off to tell us what they thought the self was, their group thought the self was, and why it's important? Otherwise, I'll just start calling on people.
Well, our group was talking about how the self is kind of your identity and your role that you play in life, and so it's a lot of compilation from everything, and it can be consistent across all settings, but usually there's some discrepancies between when you're in one setting versus another. And then we had talked about the professional setting and with our clients and kids and stuff. And so we talked about kind of how reaffirming the positive attributes of somebody and who they are, who they identify as their self, is great in therapy. And then also trying to deconstruct those negative viewpoints of somebody who's really hard on themselves or sees themselves as a failure or something like that. So
lots of stuff in there. That was great. I think you brought up a really interesting nuance that I think a lot of people are at least intuitively aware of, but don't often want to accept. And that's the idea that we do have, or at least ourselves, emerge differently in different situations. Like when you are all putting on your psychologist hat, right? And you're,
Kaufman.
What's that?
Kaufman's front stage and backstage.
Right. In American popular culture, that's often a hard pill to swallow, but it's, I think, very true that our self, however it presents, is very situationally dependent. So that's great. Did you talk about why you think it's important, Jenna? Did your group discuss that?
Why it's important to be different across?
No, why the self is an important concept.
Oh, well, it kind of tells you, it's a roadmap for your life and who you're going to be and how you interact with people. So I think that's something important. We didn't really discuss that in depth, though.
That's fine. Most people only get to the first part anyway, so that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think our group talked a lot about like balance, like in the self. So, you know, both yourself is how you're responding to the environment, how the environment affects you, but also like those intrinsic factors as well, like how you think about things, how you react to certain things internally. And Bernadette brought up a good point about how, like, yes, you do kind of, yourself is kind of different in different environments, but you don't want it to be too much. You know, you want to have, you don't want to be like, I'm going to work and I'm a completely different person than when I come home. Like it's almost like you'd want there to be some type of
authentic.
Continuity and authenticity.
Yeah. And I think like Bernadette was saying, it's like as you get older, those kind of like merge.
Yeah, because you could almost argue that if you were so different in so many different settings, then you don't actually have a true sense of self. Like,
well, and there's like mental disorders that like that's part of the criteria is that like drastic change in personality and
yeah.
And I think the hard part is just drawing lines. That's why I tend not to want to accept that a self exists, because it's, you know, it's kind of hard to draw those lines. I mean, it's I think a self is important because it helps us understand each other in social contexts, but I don't think it's like the way that we in Western culture especially put so much emphasis on it. Like who it is to be Daniel Kim is really, it's evolving. It's not static. Like that's one of the things our group was talking about. It's, you know, kind of like, you know, it's a snapshot of, you know, what I'm doing and what I'm thinking and my physiological states at a particular moment in time, and fast forward 10 years or, you know, go back in the future 10 years. And I'm not sure there's a whole lot that I have in common with where I'm at right now.
Yeah, Daniel and I were both kind of on the same page with that in the sense of not having a stable conceptualization of self that exists over the course of a lifetime, that my self as of right now is very different than my sense of self as of 20 years ago, right? So we talked about like the ship of Theseus analogy, right? So if you had a ship and over the course of time, you replaced every single component of that ship. So after a certain period of time, it was in the same shape, but it was completely different pieces. Like, is that still the same ship? Like, I'm still the same person, but my sense of self, my component identity has changed functionally over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
so I still exist, but is that sense of self the same that exists previously?
But it's all in like what reference, who the reference point is. Like,
yeah,
to the sailors on the ship, yeah, it's the same ship, because the idea of the ship is
yes,
their concept. Oh, the ship is what we travel on, what we go from point A to point B. But from the ship's perspective, like the pure an anatomical like construct, it's completely different.
Okay, so that's perfect. I love what you said, because I think it brings us to the point where in order to truly kind of regard a self, it needs to be seen through the medium of interaction with others, right? What is its functional purpose in the sense of how it's perceived and utilized in the world around us, right?
And it's like we live in this day and age where it's like we just all assume that there's this very robust self, and like, you know, I can't stand it. Like, you do you, okay, you know, like, you be who you are, you know, like, oh, who are you right now?
I'm still trying to figure that out, right? Who the hell am I?
Yeah.
It looks like you were trying to say something.
Who?
Sarah Edwards, were you trying to say something?
I was just giggling.
Oh, okay.
Laughing at Daniel.
But this is really interesting, because this is one of those consistent kind of tensions that seems to exist within, especially within American psychology. This tension between the notion of a stable self, the belief that there's got to be some core thing, whatever that thing is, that defines the self in a little box with a nice, neat little bow on it. Maybe it expresses itself slightly differently. Whereas there's, on the other kind of end of this debate, there's this idea that, well, it's sort of a fool's errand to try to come up with that, because all that the self could possibly be is, at any given moment, the pattern of neurological firings in our brain. And that changes over time. It's situationally dependent. It's contingent on our environment, on our biological makeup, and what we had for dinner, how much coffee we had that morning, all of that sort of business. So there's a real interesting tension there. And it's kind of uncomfortable for a lot of people to think that there may not be something that we could wrap up in a nice, neat little package called a self.
Mm-hmm.
So we've heard from a couple of groups. I think just group 1 and group 3. Have we heard from group 2 yet?
Yeah, well, I said something about group 2.
You're in group 2? Okay.
I was in group 2.
Good for you. What about group 4? Who's in group 4? Jenna, Alyssa?
Yeah, I'm not sure what group we were in.
Oh, didn't it tell you?
I think it did tell us. I just don't
Jack.
remember what it said.
Okay, that's fine. Anything else? Jack, did you have a comment?
Oh, no, sorry. I was holding up my finger because we were group 1.
Group 1. Okay. Well, let's turn to the next part of the question. Why is it important at all? If this...
I had a quick comment.
Oh, yeah.
You could also think of like people's social media as their projected self, and then
idealized self.
Yeah, idealized self, their front stage, and then who they are off social media is who they really are, I guess.
Yeah.
Social media is a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
social media is a fascinating
To me,
thing.
I feel. Oh,
Go ahead, Molly.
am I talking over someone?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I kind of think of it in the same way that we like stereotype others and start to understand their behaviors and predict their behaviors based on what we know from patterns or stereotypes. In some ways, the self is a way of predicting your own behaviors, or like
you're almost stereotyping yourself.
And how you understand yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a really interesting thing, because then it becomes a reciprocal process. The effects are going both ways between yourself and society and other people. And society can then also influence yourself, which makes it really complicated, right? It's an interesting.
Go
ahead, Tanner.
I've seen kind of interesting experiences with this concept of self. Playing Division I football in college, I've seen individuals who say their whole entire self is wrapped up in their identity of playing football, and when that's taken away, you see the impact that having such an encompassed identity of your own self has when it's just ultimately taken away right under your feet.
That's a really critical theme that we're actually going to touch on again later in the lecture. And it's an important one, I think, clinically and also for school psychology. This notion of how people construct their self, whether it's founded in reality or not, that has a huge amount of implications then for every bit of information that goes into their brain, how they respond. It becomes extremely
definitely. I was going to say it totally affects how you process all information that you are intaking.
Absolutely.
Well, I was just going to say, Tanner brings up a good point. Like, I think when you see, like, when you talk about like professional athletes or anybody that does anything at, you know, an exceptionally high level, what you're seeing is this like idea of like self-actualization. You know, when you see it, like, if anyone's ever seen like a dog catch a squirrel, you know, just, you know, that moment where it gets in its teeth and it's like, whoa, I have reached, you know, the pinnacle of what it is to be a dog. And
what now?
It's like the greatest moment of lives, right? And you know, you take a human being, it's you know, especially in the society that we live in now, where it's hard to decide, you know, how do we self-actualize? How do we, you know, if we were all working together to defeat, you know, another nation, suddenly we, you know, kind of feel like a more sense of like continuity and, you know, shared experience. But
yeah,
you know, when we talk about the self, I think a lot of times it's just like we have this idea that we're all like these like little discrete things walking around, you know.
That's a great example, partly because I've actually seen my dog catch a squirrel. He was dumbfounded. He didn't know what to do with it, so he dropped it and ran off. And was like, crap, that was my squirrel. But it's a great example as well, because you're exactly right. If one self-concept is so defined by achievement of one specific thing, once that thing either becomes unattainable or it becomes attained, then what? And that becomes a real danger, a real threat to that self.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and argue on that.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going back to the ship thing, right? Oh, like if I change out all of my parts to be this new ship, am I still a ship? Like Identity Crisis ocean tanker over here. What, like, isn't that the whole point of like being alive though, is to reach milestones? Like when I was 3, my next thing was like tying my shoes, and that was huge for me. And I did it, and I like, woo! And then I, you know, started to read chapter books, and that was it, woo! And then I, you know, isn't all of life getting things, learning things, becoming things, and changing over time?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what what I was getting at is that when there is no next thing. So if you have, if whatever your social environment is, that there is a next thing, that's great. It's when one self-concept becomes so defined by one singular moment in time that when that time passes and they haven't contemplated anything beyond that, that's when it becomes dangerous. If they have
and I'm not arguing that it's not dangerous. I'm not arguing that that's not the case, that, you know, but I am saying that, like, isn't that the human condition though?
Right.
So,
to do more.
Yeah, but the point that Meg brings up kind of brings us back to this question. Like, when you're tying your shoe and you're 3 years old versus sitting in a graduate seminar, are you the same self?
Well, this is a good opportunity. So this is a very rich discussion, and I hate to move it on, but this is also a good opportunity to move on to the next part of the lecture, because we're actually, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the study of the self is actually how it's changed over the years. And so what I want to do now is to talk a little bit about, and can you see the slides again, guys?
Yeah.
Yep. I want to talk with you a little bit about how this whole idea of the self has really evolved in very considerable, what just happened? shoot. There we go. It's evolved in some pretty powerful ways. So if you were to go back to the early part of the 20th century, the whole idea of a self was really, it was championed primarily in the field of sociology. And there was some kind of grand poobahs in that arena. In particular, I think his name was George Mead and Charles Cooley, two different sociologists that had some really fascinating ideas about what the self is. With Mead, he had this notion that there are really kind of two features or two facets of the self. There's the I, which is the subjective part of it, this experience that each one of us knows implicitly through our own being. We just know we do that because we are the actor. It's like our inner voice, that sort of thing. And then the other part, which is the part of ourselves that's known by other people, the objective thing that other people can see because we are an object to other people. And I don't mean objectification. I mean, we are external to the experience of other people. And so other people know us as that object that they can interact with and behave in certain ways with. And so there's this interesting kind of tension between these two parts of the self. But what's so interesting is that it really was, in his construction, was something that it is a thing. It's an actual object that it's defined in terms of our relationships with other people. And then Charles Cooley had this notion that it's called the looking glass self. And the looking glass self is actually a process. It's not a specific thing, but it's this three-stage process of first what's called imaging, and then interpreting, and then developing. The imaging is fascinating because it's almost this innate ability that we have where we don't know ourselves intrinsically, but we see ourselves through other people's eyes. And this is, typical of younger children, where everything they know about themselves is really in relationship to what they see and hear from others. And then as we gain greater maturity, we're able to start drawing conclusions from that information. We can actually start making decisions about who we think we are. And then finally synthesize all that information to have a fully developed self-concept. And that becomes the looking glass self. What's, to me, just outrageously fascinating, though, is that this is inherently social. There is nothing about these concepts of the self that isn't straight out of a social psychology framework. And it becomes also interesting that it's both this objective and subjective process. It's relationally defined. And it's not really an innate thing. Even though they define it as an object, as a thing that's real and sort of tangible in a way, it's emergent. And I think that allows for a lot of the things that we were talking about before, where there is this ability for it to be malleable and adaptable and situationally dependent. And so again, at the core, this is really not something that can exist without our social experience, which is just tremendously interesting. But what's interesting is then this was the early 1900s, right? And then over time, over the next 30, 40, 50 years, a very different image of the self emerged, which it was based on something called a homunculus. And this comes, the word homunculus actually comes from a Greek play. It's called Periclesis. You might know it if you have any experience with neuroscience. The sensory motor strip is often called the homunculus, and they overlay images of different parts of the body that represent the physical location where our somatosensory experience exists on that nerve substrate. But the homunculus, as it's defined in terms of the self, is a very different experience. It's that little dude in our brain. And some people still get this reference that this movie is getting older and older, and there will become a time.
Good Men in Black reference.
Men in Black, thank you. I'm not so old as that this is too old. Yeah, that's the ambassador who lives inside the machine, the robot.
The galaxy on Orion's belt.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Galaxy on Orion's belt. This notion of the self is just so vastly different. The idea is that the self is this thing that whether it's deep in our brain or our heart or wherever. It's that little dude that's pulling the levers. It's that little experience inside our being, and it's a very separate concept of the self. It's a self that's really this individual experience that moves our bodies around, but it doesn't have that same relational quality that Mead and Cooley described, right? So it's a very individualistic interpretation of the self. It does not talk a lot about development. And here's another image that may be kind of hard to see and decipher. This was an image that came in the early days of microscopy. And I don't know if you can, so there's this kind of bulby thing.
Womb?
What's that?
A womb? Is that a person?
It's a little person, but it's not a womb. This was their conception of a sperm. So, right, I mean, this was a very misogynistic science back then. The belief was that the sperm, there's a fully formed human that impregnates the woman and blah, blah, blah. But again, it gets to this idea that the self is not really a developmental process. It's something that exists in and of itself, fully formed from day one. Now, I mean, we can all laugh and joke about how silly that is now, but this whole idea of the self, and this was very common, remember, in the 40s and 50s, this is not social in the slightest, okay? But there's an inherent problem with this idea of the self. There's just a logical flaw. And I know some people, like Sarah, you said that you love formal logic, and other people are into philosophy. Does anybody see the flaw with this idea of the self?
It's the idea, like the nature versus nurture. Like, you can be born a certain way, but your experiences and everything shape you.
Right. There's no ability for change. Absolutely. Sarah, were you going to say something else? No. There's something
well,
else.
I know in a lot of like popular culture and in like I know the term homunculus was used in a lot of like fiction writing as like a created, synthesized person, like
right.
Like it was inspired, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Like the idea of Frankenstein was Frankenstein was creating a homunculus, and it kind of, the problem is it's a finite thing that isn't you. It's not something that it's like adaptable. It's like you create this singular like construct, and that's how it is.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, the Paraclesis Greek myth, that's actually what the myth was all about too. The homunculus was like a little 12-inch grunt, a little laborer that did all the work without having much of a soul. And think about it this way. So here's the ambassador living inside the robot. If that's the little dude pulling all the levers, what about him? What about the ambassador? So does he have a homunculus in his head? And then what about that homunculus? Does that homunculus have something in its head? And so it's this concept of reduction to absurdity. It becomes kind of this infinite loop of another homunculus. So there's no real way. Go ahead, Jack.
Oh, sorry. That's what I was talking about in the post I made on that conceptualization of self, which is like in trying to observe your own thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you think about, well, what kind of presuppositions or bias do I bring to my observations of my own thoughts? Well, then I'm observing the observer.
Yeah.
And then can I observe that observer? And then it becomes this kind of like infinite.
Never ending.
Anyways, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. It's like this spiral, and there's no real clear way to define it, right?
Yeah.
What was
it? At a certain point, I feel like you have to kind of be like, okay, I have to still, reflect on my thoughts. Like you can't go down the slippery slope argument, because otherwise you'll never like reflect on your thoughts, whatever, because you'd be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because it's like completely subjective. And I feel like there's still some like therapeutic
but there's a
necessity to do that.
I think what you're getting at is that we still want to be able to think about the self as an important concept. But the problem is the way that it was thought about in the 40s and 50s as this separate thing, that concept doesn't work. And there's actually an alternative. Thankfully, there's an alternative that emerged sort of during the revolution of the computers that occurred in the 60s and 70s. And that was to reframe the self not as a specific thing per se, but to start thinking about it in terms of processes. And back in the 60s and 70s, the concept of a self really became kind of modeled on the computer programs of the day, which were very linear. Like this process happened, and then there was an arrow to this one, and then an arrow to this one. And if you ever go back and look at cognitive psychology articles from that era, 60s and 70s, that's exactly what it looks like. It was like this step-by-step process of, from point A to point B, and then that was it. It was just like one linear, from beginning to end, one linear process, which becomes really a lot more powerful because that we can start thinking about all the different ways that it emerges and changes. But what's still so interesting is that at this point, it's very non-social still. It's sort of like all of these different modules that live in our brain and they lead to these outcomes, but they're just there. And it didn't really talk about development at all, which is today, it's sort of modern psychologists would kind of scratch their head like, you didn't think about where this came from, but that's fascinating. And this concept of the self largely didn't have anything to do with emotions or affect or culture, any of these things that today we would say give a lot of richness to our self-experience. That was just completely gone. It just wasn't there. This idea of the self became a lot more palatable to people because it was process-based as opposed to object-based. But this was back in the 60s and 70s. Of course, things are going to change. Then in the 80s, and this was really the height of self-psychology. Carol Marcus in particular was a really big champion of the idea of studying the self as an important process within human psychology. The conception of it transitioned from a thing to a process, and now it's everything. And this is really, people would talk about the self as everything. And let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. It really was a mediator. It was this thing through which we saw everything in our world, and the world came through that self. And so it now became possible, because it was everything, to encompass these emotions and cultural experience. It was also based on computational processes and all of the things that, yes, are in our brain that are pretty, cut and dry, like vision. I mean, vision is just a very straightforward computational process in comparison to some of these other more squishy things that we worry about. So it can become social and non-social as well. And one way to really think about it is in this schematic where we have society and it defines then what our self is, and then that self leads to our social behavior. And really, these should be back and forth arrows between all of these things. They're very interactive and reciprocal. And this became the predominant paradigm for a long, long time. And I want to pause here for just a minute and give everybody a chance to take that in for a minute and tell me what you think of that. This idea that the self is everything. Does this sound like a powerful way to think about the self, or does it just completely miss the mark?
No, I think it goes along with what we were saying before. It's everything that you interact with. It's who you are in the world. So who you are definitely is defined as yourself, society, and your social behavior.
So you like it, Jenna. You find it powerful. You find it
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's a cogent way for you to think about this. Good.
Mm-hmm.
What do other people think?
I think it seems somewhat precarious. It just seems so subject to the external world. And I understand defining the self in relationship to the external world, but it just seems entirely too referential, I guess.
Too referential?
I guess too, like it's really kind of an external locus of control, so to speak.
So I think what you're saying is then it doesn't allow for any intrinsic experience to define.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Wouldn't it mean like those intrinsic experiences are somewhat defined upon our like previous extrinsic experiences?
What do y'all think?
I just kind of think that we're all social beings, that most things that we do has been learned. So to have a self that's based on society and then have social behavior, I don't know, it makes sense to me. I'm just kind of confused by what Jack was saying, I guess. I don't know. I'm sorry, I have a headache too. So that's why it may not be synthesizing properly. But.
That's okay. Jack, why don't you try one more time?
Well, I guess what I was saying is and I could be misunderstanding this, but it seems like it kind of excludes the nature aspect of the nature versus nurture dichotomy.
So so
like the animal brain.
No, not the animal brain so much as
like one's true decision or choice or without influence from the social. Is that?
I guess it seems like it discounts what a person, what they naturally bring to the table.
What
like
they're bringing genetically.
Yeah, that might be one way to think about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's all kind of built in too.
Or is that part of the self?
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, like social behavior, it's pretty common across most people that if someone comes at you running and yelling, you're going to be like, whoa, this guy's a weirdo. So like, I feel like it all kind of goes together, and the nature builds the society and the nature builds the self. And then just our interactions kind of change it for each individual person. But it might be there. I'm not sure.
One of the issues I have with like the society is it's too big of a bucket for me to kind of get my head around. Like, I mean, I guess what's going on in Wisconsin has some sort of influence on me, but much more what's going on in my immediate surroundings, like my sort of nest. I think that has, I don't know, it's a real big bucket, and I think that's one of the things I don't love about it.
Well, I think that like conceptualizing society and like the way that Bronfenbrenner does it in terms of like spheres of influence, like there's different levels of society that are going to have certain levels of impact on yourself. Like my parents and my siblings are definitely going to matter more than like, what happens in Ecuador or something like that. I feel like every level of like you'd have to really further define society in order for this construct to work.
But I think yes and no at the same time, because I think they're not referring to like the entire society of the world. They're talking about like your immediate like exposure. Like, I don't know. I just think of like people like assimilation and like, if you have, I don't know how to say this any other way, but like how you talk to your black friends versus how do you talk to your white friends, like they're both like they're a different self that you have cultivated and curated in order to fit in with that social group. So I think it's less of like the grand macro, like grand society, but more of the like, I don't know. I'm done. I don't have anything else to say. I lost my thought.
What all of you are struggling with, I think, is one of the key, when this first emerged, one of the key criticisms of this is that it's very vague. It's called a grand theory. It doesn't get into a lot of details. This is not a process for people to think about it. Accept it based on just that very process. Uh-oh.
Sarah, you got to be the host.
Edwards is the host now, right?
What?
Hello, host.
All right, everybody, get your wine.
Could you hear us the whole time?
I couldn't hear anything.
Oh, okay.
Oh, he missed out on some rich conversation.
I missed it. I'm so bummed. And you missed my all the wonderful things I was saying. I'm sure you're all broken up about it. But I mean, what I was saying is that one of the criticisms of this model is that it's very vague and general. It's a grand theory. It's not a specific theory. And so it's hard to know what to do with it other than to say, well, yeah, I mean, we all process the world around us through whatever our self is and through our brain. Yeah. And that affects society, of course. So it's sort of like, what do we do with that information? And I think that's a valid criticism. I think the important thing, though, is that it really does point out that the self is a mediator. And we do, in fact, it influences our behavior, and our behavior influences society. And so it has this kind of back and forth way. And when you get enough people together within a society, it gets really complicated really quickly, which is an interesting way to oh my God, my computer is just pitching a fit. Oh my God. Just killing me here. Okay. I'm going to stop my sharing for just a minute as I try to figure out what's going on with my computer. I think this is a good opportunity, folks, for us to take a break. Because I'm going to restart my computer, and hopefully that's going to fix it. If you would all stay on and go and take a break and relax for a minute, hopefully when I get back, we will have no more technological problems. So I'll see you in a few.
Okay. How many minutes?
5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thereabouts. Now I can't even turn this off. What is going on?